Ranger did not bark when Daniel Hayes's photograph appeared on the memorial screen. That was what frightened Ethan Cole. A nervous dog barked. An angry dog pulled. Ranger went perfectly still. The scarred Malinois stood beside Ethan in the K9 honor line. 90 pounds of muscle and old wounds, staring past the folded flags toward the cheapest section of the courtyard. At the very back, behind a silver crowd barrier, a young woman in an oversized navy field jacket had frozen with both hands on a battered wooden box. She looked too young to carry the kind of grief in her face, and too out of place to be connected to the hero whose name was carved in stone. The announcer began reading Daniel's citation. Words like courage, sacrifice, and classified operation rolled through the speakers. Ranger's lips lifted. Not at the crowd. Not at Ethan. At the sound of Daniel's name being polished for strangers, Ethan whispered the command printed on the dog's file. Ranger. Heel. The dog did not hear him, or worse. He heard and refused the lie. Then a medal on Commander Briggs's chest caught the light as the commander stepped near the aisle. And Ranger snapped. He drove forward so violently the leash tore Ethan off balance. Guests screamed. A wreath toppled. The other K9s whined and strained against their handlers. Not following him, but mourning with him. Security swung rifles into position. The young woman backed into the barrier. Not from fear, but from recognition. She opened the box as Ranger came at her. Fast and low. A black shape cutting through white chairs and dress uniforms. A guard grabbed her sleeve. She twisted free, dropped to the ground inside the yellow line, and placed a dull dog tag on the concrete. Then she did something no civilian should have known. She lowered her palm the way a seal handler lowers a storm. Ranger skidded in front of her. The snarl died. His nose touched the tag. Then the sleeve of Daniel's jacket, and his body folded as if grief had finally found the right door. He laid his head on her knee. Stay with this story. Subscribe, and watch why Ghost broke formation for the daughter everyone had erased. Because the name on his harness was not the name in his heart. And the memorial became a trial without a courtroom that night. 3 hours before Ghost broke the memorial open, Emily Hayes stood outside the west gate with bus dust on her boots and her father's field jacket hanging too loose across her shoulders. The base rose beyond the fence in clean lines of steel. Grass, flags, and men who moved like the world made sense when every name was checked against a list. Emily had taken 2 buses before sunrise and walked the last mile along the service road. Not because she wanted sympathy, but because getting there mattered more than arriving with dignity intact. She carried one small box under her arm, though she no longer held it like a mystery. She held it like proof. At the checkpoint, the guard studied her license, her printed memorial notice, and the tablet glowing in his hand. The name Hayes made him pause. But the screen did not bend for blood. Daniel Hayes, according to the official guest record, had no daughter attending, no active dependent, and no family member requiring escort to the front section. Emily unfolded her birth certificate with fingers made clumsy by cold and showed him a childhood photograph of Daniel kneeling in a backyard beside a dark Malinois and a little girl with scraped knees. For a moment, the guard looked less certain. Then Procedure took his face back. She was asked to wait beside the barrier while decorated spouses, officers, and invited relatives passed through without being questioned. By the time Commander Victor Briggs arrived, Emily had already learned that grief without credentials could be treated like a security problem. Briggs did not shout. He did not need to. His uniform was perfect. His voice measured. His sympathy polished to a shine that never reached his eyes. He reviewed her papers as if they were inconvenient, then explained that the ceremony had been arranged through verified military channels and that all of Daniel Hayes's personal effects had been processed years ago. The sentence landed wrong. It did not merely dismiss her. It contradicted the dog tag her mother had hidden in a dresser drawer, the one that arrived 6 months after Daniel's funeral in a plain envelope with no return address. Emily had spent years wondering why one tag came home late, why a strip of worn collar leather had been wrapped around it, and why Daniel's last letters had stopped mentioning the Navy but kept mentioning a K-9 named Ghost. In those letters, Ghost was never described as equipment. He was stubborn, brilliant, half shadow and half heartbeat. The dog who slept against Daniel's bunk and woke before danger had a sound. Emily asked only to place the tag near her father's name on the memorial wall. Briggs refused with the calm of a man closing a file. He offered her a place near the rear visitor line, away from the families, away from the cameras, away from any angle that might raise questions no one wanted answered. She accepted because she had not come to embarrass her father's command. She had come to see whether the dog from those letters was still alive. Then she saw him in the front formation, older now, scarred across the muzzle, wearing a harness marked Ranger. The wrong name hit harder than Briggs's refusal. On his left shoulder was the pale crescent Daniel had once described after a blast outside Kandahar. The wound Ghost took when he threw himself between Daniel and flying metal. Emily knew that scar before she knew the dog's eyes. She also saw what the handlers missed. The Malinois did not relax when his new name was used. He tightened. When Briggs stepped near him, his body went still in a guarded, deliberate way. It was not rage. It was recognition sharpened by warning. Emily felt the cold leave her hands. Her father had not left her a keepsake. He had left her a living question buried under another name. Somewhere inside that harness was the last piece of Daniel Hayes that the official program had forgotten. And every rule at that gate seemed designed to keep his daughter from reaching it before the ceremony began. By the time the honor detail pulled Ghost behind the memorial wall, the ceremony no longer felt like a ceremony. The chairs in the front row had been shoved crooked by people trying not to look afraid. Flags still moved in the wind. But the music had stopped, and every uniform near the equipment canopy seemed to be waiting for permission to breathe again. Ghost stood inside a temporary kennel with 2 steel leads clipped to his harness and dust streaked across his paws. He did not throw himself at the bars. He did not bark at every hand. That was what made him worse to the men who feared him. He stood too still, head low, eyes fixed on the space where Commander Briggs had just walked away. As if the old dog had not lost control at all, but had found the one man in the crowd he could not stop watching. Ethan Cole, the handler assigned to him 6 months earlier, kept one gloved hand on the leash and the other near the release buckle. Caught between what he had been told and what he was seeing, the file on Ghost had always read like a warning label. Severe aggression. Handler reactive. Failed rehabilitation. Civilian contact prohibited. Disposal review pending. Ethan had believed enough of it to be careful. The bite reports were real. The broken crate door was real. The dent in the transport van was real. But now, with Emily still held beyond the security line and Ghost trembling only when certain people moved, the pattern looked less like madness and more like memory. The dog did not lunge at random guards. He reacted to the snap of the rear van lock. He stiffened when a hand reached under his harness toward the old leather collar. He went silent when Daniel Hayes's name was spoken. And when Briggs came within 10 feet, Ghost angled his scarred body between the commander and the collar as though guarding something that could not be replaced. The military veterinarian opened a black medical case on a folding table. preparing a sedative with the tired efficiency of someone who had handled dangerous animals before. Briggs returned with transfer papers already clipped to a board. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes kept cutting toward Emily and then toward Ghost's neck. The official explanation was simple enough for witnesses to accept. After a public disruption at a memorial event, the K-9 would be removed from ceremonial duty and transferred to Mercer Defense for controlled retraining. Ethan looked down at the date on the order, and the first real crack opened inside him. The transfer had been approved 2 days earlier, before Ghost broke formation. Before Emily crossed the barrier, before anyone could claim the dog had embarrassed the command in front of families and cameras, the incident had not caused the decision. It had given the decision a story. Emily saw the Mercer logo from beyond the line and remembered it from one of Daniel's last letters, written in careful phrases that had once seemed vague and now felt like warnings. Her father had mentioned contractors moving through restricted zones with too much access and too little oversight. He had not accused anyone outright. But Daniel Hayes had never wasted ink. She stepped forward, and a guard blocked her with a hard arm across her path. Ghost heard the shift of her boots on concrete. His ears moved toward her. For one brief second, the growl in his chest faded, and the canopy seemed to loosen around them. Ethan noticed it. The veterinarian noticed it. Briggs noticed it most of all. He ordered the sedative used before the crowd outside began asking questions. The needle came closer. The vet reached for the exposed place beneath the harness where the old collar rubbed against Ghost's neck. The instant his fingers touched the seam, Ghost exploded. Not upward toward the man's face, not outward toward Emily, but downward and sideways, twisting his entire body over that strip of worn leather. The handlers hauled back. Metal rang. The van lock snapped again, sharp and hollow, and Ghost's eyes went somewhere no one else could follow. His paws scraped trenches through the dust. His teeth flashed, but every movement still protected the collar. Ethan grabbed the harness expecting pain, yet Ghost only shoved against him, desperate to keep human hands away from what lay hidden there. In that moment, Ethan understood the file had described the injuries, but not the wound. Ghost was not fighting because he was broken. He was fighting because the wrong people were about to take the last thing Daniel Hayes had left behind. If you believe a loyal K-9 deserves more than a cold report, comment for Ghost. Share this story with someone who would understand. And subscribe before we step into the moment Emily finally calls him by the name the Navy tried to bury. Emily did not run toward Ghost. She moved because everything in front of her had narrowed to one impossible choice: stay behind the security line and watch the tranquilizer end him, or step into the bite zone with the only language her father had ever left her. The guard blocking her was watching Ethan fight the harness, and the second guard had turned toward the rifle team. That was the only opening. Emily slipped past the hard arm at her chest, ducked between two folding chairs, shoved sideways by the panic, and crossed the yellow line before anyone could grab more than the sleeve of Daniel's jacket. The moment she entered the canopy, every man hesitated. No one wanted to rush her, because a sudden tackle from behind would drive Ghost straight through the handlers. Briggs raised his hand, but the order caught in the air useless. Already too late. Ghost saw her. Not the guards. Not the needle. Not even Briggs. His eyes found the faded field jacket first, then the box under her arm, then the trembling fingers she kept open where he could see them. Ethan felt the change through the leash. The dog's strength did not vanish, but it turned, redirected from blind resistance into terrible focus. Emily lowered herself slowly. Daniel had written that a cornered war dog did not need a crowd above him. He needed space, scent, and one signal he could trust. Her knee touched the concrete. Dust dampened the denim of her jeans. She set the small box down as carefully as if it held a heart that could still break. This time, she did not fumble with mystery. She opened the lid fully, letting everyone see the dull dog tag, the strip of cracked collar leather, and the old photograph of Daniel kneeling beside the black Malinois when both of them were younger and unbroken. The smell rose before the memory did salt, dried into cotton. Gun oil buried in leather. The faint cedar of a closet that had guarded grief for years. Ghost pulled one breath through his nose and shook as if the air had struck him. The veterinarian froze with the needle half hidden in his fist. The rifle team lowered an inch without being told. Ethan did not release the leads, but he stopped hauling back. Emily lifted her hand, then paused. She could have repeated the signal like a trick for the men watching. But Ghost was not a trick, and Daniel had never trained him to obey strangers for applause. So she let the dog watch her breathe first. Her fingers pressed once against the worn cloth over her chest. Not as command, but as memory. Then her palm opened low toward the ground, patient and empty. The name came out barely louder than the wind. Ghost. He was already moving when he heard it. His body had committed forward, his paws dug into concrete dust, shoulders bunching beneath the scarred fur. Jaws parted in a shape every guard read as attack. Then the name reached whatever place in him had survived war. Grief. Shock. Wrong collars. And 6 months of being called Ranger. He stopped so hard the steel leads snapped tight behind him. The growl broke off, leaving a raw sound that was almost a breath. His ears rose, his eyes changed. The weapon everyone feared became, for one suspended second, a lost creature trying to find the door back to a dead man. Ghost lowered his nose to the tag. Metal touched the scar along his lip, and he flinched. But he did not retreat. He smelled Daniel there, faint and impossible. Then he smelled Emily beneath it. The same blood softened by another life. Another voice. A whine came from him, small enough to break the hardest faces under the canopy. Emily kept her hand still. She did not grab his neck or fall across him for comfort. She let him choose. Ghost took one slow step, then another, each softer than the violence that had carried him there. His muzzle touched her fingertips, withdrew, and returned with a shudder that passed through his entire body. Only then did Ethan loosen the leads. Ghost folded down one leg at a time, fighting surrender until surrender became relief. His chest met the concrete beside Daniel's tag. His head settled near Emily's knee. Around them, the canopy held its breath. The rifle dropped fully. The veterinarian closed the medical case. Briggs stared at the old collar exposed beneath the harness. And for the first time, his fear was visible. Ethan followed that look and saw the uneven seam in the leather. A hidden ridge no standard collar should have carried. Ghost had not been protecting himself. He had been protecting Daniel's secret. The moment Ghost settled beside Emily, the panic did not disappear. It changed shape. Men who had been ready to shoot him now stood with their hands half raised, unsure whether lowering their weapons would admit they had been wrong. Ethan kept one hand on the loosened lead and stared at the old collar exposed beneath the harness. The uneven seam looked small, almost harmless. But Ghost's entire body had fought to protect it. Briggs noticed Ethan looking and stepped forward. That was the first mistake. Fear crossed his face before command could cover it. And several people saw it. Ethan did not accuse him. He only asked the veterinarian to hold the sedative and requested a legal officer from the memorial staff. Because anything hidden in a military working dog's equipment had to be logged before it was touched. The request sounded procedural, which made it harder for Briggs to fight without exposing urgency. A young lieutenant arrived with a body camera still blinking from the ceremony detail, and a master-at-arms moved the guests farther from the canopy. Emily remained on her knees, palm open near Ghost's muzzle, while the dog watched every hand that came near the collar. The harness came off slowly. Each buckle click made Ghost flinch, and each flinch told Ethan more than the reports ever had. Emily did not repeat the signal like a trick. She breathed once, lowered her hand, and let Ghost hear calm instead of force. When the cracked leather was finally visible, the seam did not match the rest of the collar. It had been opened, resewn, then rubbed with dirt and oil to make the repair look old. The veterinarian photographed it before anyone cut a thread. Briggs objected under the language of classified property, but nobody moved back. Inside the seam, wrapped in waterproof field plastic, was a micro-storage card no wider than a thumbnail. It did not explode the case open. It did not solve the murder of a seal in a single breath. It only made the silence honest. The legal officer sealed it in a clear evidence sleeve, read the serial number aloud for the camera, and connected it to a secure tablet that could preview files without copying them. The first screen showed dates, coordinates, and an operation code that matched Daniel Hayes's final mission but did not match the sanitized memorial report. That was enough to alter authority in the room. The legal officer ordered the transfer paused until Naval Criminal Investigative Service could receive the device. Briggs tried to frame the pause as unnecessary delay, but his voice had lost its polish. Ethan watched the commander's eyes keep returning to the card, then to Mercer's logo on the van. The Mercer representative, who had stayed in the background with a clipboard and sunglasses, started making a phone call until the master-at-arms told him to lower the device. No one called it an arrest. Not yet. But the exits filled with uniforms. The tablet could preview only one audio file before the officer stopped himself from digging deeper without a forensic team. The recording lasted less than a minute. Wind struck the microphone. Rotors beat overhead. Daniel's voice, thin with exhaustion, reported Mercer crates, marked for humanitarian transport, moving restricted guidance components through a closed corridor. Another voice answered with a change in extraction route. It was not a confession, not the clean courtroom thunder people expect from stories. But every officer there recognized the second voice. Briggs did too. His jaw tightened as Daniel warned that the contractor had been tipped off. Emily did not cry when she heard her father. She went so still that Ghost lifted his head and pressed his shoulder against her knee. For years, Daniel's death had been explained to her with phrases that sounded respectful and empty. A bad route, poor visibility, enemy contact, impossible recovery. Now she had heard him alive inside the lie, naming what he saw before the ambush swallowed him. The legal officer shut the file and sealed the tablet, because even grief had to wait for chain of custody. That restraint kept the scene from becoming theater, and made it worse. More pieces surfaced without opening the device. The metadata showed the file had been created before Ghost returned to base and modified once. Months later, from a terminal linked to Briggs's office, Ethan checked the service history on the transfer packet and saw the erasure clearly. Daniel's name appeared nowhere as primary handler. Ghost appeared nowhere at all. Ranger had been born on paper after Daniel died. After Emily's dependent status was sealed, after the first aggression report claimed the dog attacked during routine collar inspection, Ethan looked at the burns beneath the fur and then closed the folder slowly. Briggs was not handcuffed in front of the families. That would come later, if the investigation earned it. Instead, the base executive officer arrived, listened to the legal summary, and relieved Briggs of command pending review. The words were calm, almost quiet. But they struck harder than shouting. Briggs surrendered his access badge. Then his radio, while Ghost watched from beside Emily with his chin lifted and his body still angled protectively across her legs. The Mercer transfer was officially suspended on the spot. The van remained parked. Doors open. Its purpose now suddenly exposed as something other than rescue. For Emily, the victory did not feel clean. It felt like standing at the edge of a locked room and hearing her father breathing on the other side. She knew the card had to be examined, the audio authenticated, the records pulled, the witnesses questioned, and the years of lies taken apart one signature at a time. But the first door had opened. Ghost had forced it open by remembering what men had renamed. As investigators sealed the collar and the card, he lowered his muzzle onto Daniel's tag. And Emily understood the next fight would be for his name. 3 weeks after the memorial, the truth no longer belonged to whispers under a canopy. The storage card was examined by forensic technicians. The audio was authenticated, and the old mission logs were pulled from servers that several men had hoped nobody would open again. What came back was worse than anyone at the ceremony had been ready to hear. Daniel Hayes had not led his team into disaster through carelessness or bad luck. He had reported a Mercer defense shipment, moving restricted components under relief markings. And within hours, his extraction route had been changed through an order linked to Commander Briggs. The inquiry did not turn grief into revenge overnight. It moved like the military always moves when evidence becomes undeniable. Slowly, formally, and with signatures that felt too small for the damage they described. Briggs was relieved, then suspended, then placed under criminal investigation. Mercer's transfer contract was frozen, its representatives questioned, and every aggression report written after Ghost returned from Daniel's last mission was reopened. Ethan Cole gave a statement that cost him more than rank. He admitted he had trusted a file because trusting a file was easier than kneeling beside a wounded dog and asking who had made him that way. The burns under Ghost's fur were photographed. The false name change was documented. The missing handler history was restored one line at a time. And each correction felt like another shovelful of dirt being lifted off Daniel's grave. Emily was called back to the base not as a visitor, not as an inconvenience, and not as a girl standing behind a barrier. She was received as Daniel Hayes' daughter and surviving family. Her name returned to the record with the plain force of something that should never have been stolen. When the officer slid the corrected papers toward her, Emily signed without trembling. But Ghost leaned against her knee as if he remembered every day the world had told her she did not belong. The final ceremony was smaller than the first one, with no cameras invited and no polished speech. Pretending pain could be arranged neatly. The wall had been cleaned after the storm, and Daniel's name stood dark against the stone. This time, Emily walked through the front gate with Ghost beside her, his leash loose, his service marker repaired, his real name hanging where the lie had been. Ethan walked a step behind them, not as the man controlling the dog, but as the man who had helped bring him home. The amended citation was read aloud, not as a dramatic confession, but as the kind of official truth Daniel had died trying to protect. It named his warning. It named the altered route. It named Ghost as the military working dog who carried critical evidence out of a compromised field. When Emily placed Daniel's dog tag beneath the engraved name, Ghost lowered his muzzle once to the metal, gentle as prayer, then sat back with the stillness of a soldier finally dismissed from watch. The retirement papers came 2 days later. There was no parade, no headline large enough for what had been restored, only a signature, a medical plan, and a transport crate. Ghost refused to enter until Emily touched the door and waited. She took him to a small house miles from the base, a place with a narrow porch, old floorboards, rain gutters that rattled in the wind, and Daniel's field jacket hanging beside the door. Ghost paused at the threshold, tasting the air for threats that were no longer there. Emily did not pull him inside. She opened the door wider and let him choose. After a long minute, he stepped in on his own. That night, he ignored the blanket she bought for him and slept in the hallway where he could see the front door, the kitchen window, and the shadow of Emily's bedroom. Only then did she understand the last line of Daniel's letter, the one saying Ghost would keep guarding the family even when no war was left to fight. Months later, when the nightmares came less often, Emily framed the corrected citation beside the old photograph of Daniel and Ghost. The dog would sleep under it in the amber light of evening. Gray muzzle across the dog tag that had once shaken an entire memorial awake. Nothing about the ending erased what had been taken. But the house held something the records never could. Peace earned by loyalty that refused to forget. Thank you for staying with Ghost and Emily to the end. If this story reminded you that a K9 can carry truth when people bury it, leave a comment for Ghost. Share the story. And subscribe to support the channel before the next story finds its way to you soon.